This is episode 23 of the World Builders Anvil. Today's topic, fantasy world building cultural fashion show. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and thank you for listening to the World Builders Anvil. And today's topic is cultural fashion show. That's right. I, Jeffrey W. Ingram, am going to talk about fashion. And if you're not sure that I am capable of talking about fashion, I would suggest you go out to one of my social media outlets on Twitter, Facebook, or Google+, and look up episode 23 in its image. That will prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am ultimately qualified to talk about fashion. There's two main things I like to talk about when talking about cultural appearance, which is really what I'm talking about today. First, there's visual appearance. How do they look? And this will probably be a subset of the race or races that appear within a culture. There will be certain commonalities with the larger racial group, but you'll probably be more likely to see a more restrictive number of hair colors, at least until people start coloring their hair. And the other thing is dress. Clothing is very important to races. The style of clothes they use, the color of clothes they use, and as time goes on, how important is the tradition of it? I'm going to throw weapons in here too, because early on, oftentimes, a culture is identified with a weapon. And this really goes probably up until the point they start becoming a state. A weapon becomes almost a second name for a culture, and that might become the name of a tribe. So first, visual appearance. So what am I talking about? First, common skin colors. If there are variations within the race for skin colors, what are the most likely skin colors to be seen in this group? And then depending on the way magic influences your world or the level of technology and healthcare, you're probably going to see that skin color dominant for a while. And it might not just be one. There could be a small range. But once again, it will probably be a subset of what is seen within the larger racial group. And once again, if you have an appearance set aside for your racial groups, you should, as you go through your cultures, make sure that it's covered in your racial appearance as well. Common eye color. I have blue eyes. Other people have brown eyes. You might have eye colors that are not common on Earth, where your stories are taking place. But what are the common eye colors? And on top of common, I like to know what are the special ones, What are the ones that are a little less common? You'll probably see a bit more variety in eye color, but that's not necessarily true. But you can typically see more variation in eye color than skin color. But once again, that's not always true. Make it the way you want it to be. Height and weight. What is the height and weight that is common in the time of your story? And I mention that because typically nutrition plays a huge part in the height and weight of a culture, especially the height. Early agricultural peoples will be shorter than hunter-gatherers, and it's largely believed to be caused by lessened health conditions, more diseases, a little bit less variety in nutrition. These will typically make early agricultural groups smaller than hunter-gatherer groups. However, with magic or technology, those kind of things will end up changing over time. Weight, once again, a lot of that will be dependent on one, the availability of food, and two, the natural tendency to retain fat. And usually, the harder it is to survive, the more likely the bodies are to retain fat. That is actually a survival thing that your bodies gather early on in the evolution of a race. People who are more likely to gain weight in periods of time when famine are more common are more likely to survive a famine because they have fat in their bodies as reserves to be eaten up in those times of scarcity. Hair color is another one I like to talk about. And once again, you might have your common blondes, brunettes, brown, black, whatever you want to call the hair color. This is a place to put the common hair colors, and I also like to put, once again, a little bit less common. So you might have 1, 2, or 3 hair colors, and the same for eye, like 1, 2, or 3 eye colors that might show up. And skin colors, I'm less likely to vary. However, it also depends on the evolution of your world. The predominance of magic might make the necessity of changing skin colors less common. So, like in my world, people tend to be more brown or beige. There are white people in my world. However, I think a lot of those changes on Earth are, for whatever reason, just for millennium of trying to survive in certain areas. And with the power of magic in my world, it kind of offsets the need for that. So you'll still see in colder climates a little bit more tendency to see white people. However, black and brown will be much more common, especially brown, because in my world, humans started near the center of the world in an area much more like Persia and modern day Earth. So the skin colors will kind of reflect that naturally, and darker and lighter do happen, and you'll kind of see them intermingled a bit more. However, like I said, I don't think, because of the way my world evolved and with magic, that the needs to hyper specialize and gain whatever benefits you possibly gain for having certain skin colors are less important because of magic. So especially the wealthier people are, the more variation there will be. And now when we talk about visual appearance, if there are multiple races that are attached to a cultural group, you'll need to do this for each of the races. What are the variations from the racial norms? Dress. Okay, I like clothing. Clothing is very important. I am actually wearing clothing right now. You'll all be glad to know. But what is the common clothing your race likes to wear? And when I say common clothing, do they wear pants? Do they wear tunics? Do they wear robes? Do they wear kilts, skirts, something else that you can think of? Any form of common clothing. And a lot of times you want to differentiate between wealthy and poor people. It might be different. And if there is, you'll want to distinguish that here. But what are the common clothing types within a culture? And for that, what are the common colors used? For example, maybe if it's a wooded area, you'll have more greens, more browns, more earth tones. If it's more of a city culture, there might be a different kind of variety of colors that are available that don't necessarily mix into the common scheme of colors that you see in nature. Otherwise, the clothing color options will probably, on a common level, vary the colors that are around the cultural. And over time, there might be an adoption of other colors. Colors often add meaning or context to clothing or buildings or lights, i.e. a red light district, or you might have a red or blue tunic in Rome, or even purple at certain points. Those all have meanings culturally. So those kind of variations you want to break down here and say, okay, I use purple to indicate poor people. I use green to indicate rich people. People in this color clothing are in this status of my culture. The next thing are materials. What are the common materials used to create clothing in the area? Once again, if they are like a hunting race, it's probably going to be leathers from the things they hunt. And maybe even if they're a woodland area, maybe they rely more on hunting to gain skins for clothing. Or if they have a lot of excess food, perhaps they start developing clothing from plants like cotton and stuff like that. Common weapons. And I got into this a little bit earlier, but common weapons culturally are important. Do they use bows? Are they recurved bows? Are they long bows? Are they short bows? What kind of bows do they commonly use? Is there a common type of weapon you're likely to see people with? A spear, a sword, a type of those. And I have one cultural group that when you break down the subcultures, each of the subcultural groups are actually named after a predominant weapon type for that cultural group. And then as time goes on, you start to have traditional clothing versus modern clothing. And the bulk for that will keep changing through time. Something that would be considered modern 50 years ago is not modern today. However, traditional clothing will probably change a little more slowly. However, once it's considered traditional, when and where to use traditional garb, if at all, or when to use modern garb, if at all. Well, obviously, even if you refuse to change your clothing at all, which would be odd, you would consider it modern, I guess. It would become one thing. But I think there's always going to be an evolution of clothing over time because it's a way for people to distinguish their status within a culture. And material is one way to do that. Color is one way to do that. Type of clothing is another way of doing that. However, over time, as it becomes cheaper to make things like the rich people do, and the poor people start adopting it more, the rich people are going to probably start adopting something else. The rating for this episode. The rating for this episode is basic. You need to know what people in your main cultural group or the cultures that are involved in your work in progress look like. Both how they dress and how they look, especially if you have a wide variety in your world. What does the cultural group that we're dealing with look like? And you might not get into it because it's not going to be super important. If you're dealing with a race of predominantly black people and another black person comes in, that's not going to probably stick out in their mind. Or if you're dealing with an orcish cultural group and an orc from a different culture comes in, they're not going to sit there and go, oh, he's an orc. They're going to just sit there and think he's a normal being. However, if you have an elf or a dwarf or a human go into that situation, then he's more likely to go, oh, an elf. How pretty. Or how ugly, probably. One man's pretty is another woman's ugly. The world building task for the day. Take your major cultural group in the work in progress and become a fashion designer, just like me. And if you're as successful as me, you can do creations as good as my battle dress uniform for world builders. So sit down, do spend some time on this because once again, you can refer back to it. So in the area that you sort of have your World Bible in, you want to track this stuff. So when you come up with a new character that you want to introduce and maybe you want to talk about how they're dressed, you can look back to say, how are they dressed in comparison to other people in the culture? And maybe everyone from around here typically wears tunics, but the people from where he comes from don't. They wear a different kind of top. They like more of a blouse. So make sure to write down. You can refer back to it. It'll help you come up with descriptions for people in your world later on a little bit quicker because you'll know what's common or uncommon. And then depending on the character, how likely they are to deviate from the cultural norm. And you might also want to revisit the rules for your culture too, because if someone wears a color for royalty and they're not royalty, there could be consequences within a culture. The real world task for the day. This is important. I learned this one as I was developing a meme to circulate this episode with. And that is clean up the floor before you take a picture to share with the internet. Because if you don't, it will be noticed by your significant other. And they will tell you that you not to go clean up the floor. And that is embarrassing to show a mess on the floor. Make sure to clean up the floor before you take the picture. Unless you really need the mess there, like I did. The tease for this episode is world building cultural evolution. That's right, back to evolution again already. But this next episode will be focused on the cultural versions of it. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.